Shalom. We are now at, welcome to our Bible study class. We are now at chapter 11 of our journey through Tanakh, through the Bible, with exploring the life of King David. We are in the second book of Samuel, and so far, until this point, David has done virtually no wrong. He has been everything we had hoped he would be. He's a fierce warrior. He is a beloved friend. He is a spiritual person, constantly calling out to God. He is respectful of the kingship, of the monarchy, even when the monarchy wants to kill him. He's audacious. He is open with everyone. He is into unity, and he does all of that. And he even brings the ark to Yerushalayim, and he wants to build a Beit HaMikdash. If we stopped the story right here, we would say he is the greatest, not only king, but the greatest biblical personality ever. And when I say great, I mean not just in terms of his achievements, but also in terms of his moral, his values, his morals, his attitudes, his actions. And then we hit chapter 11. And chapter 11 is tragic. It's a tragic story. It's the beginning of the spiraling fall of David's height, and losing of his kingdom, and losing of his son, and losing of his authority, and everything that happens because of one moment of weakness. Now, it's not just that he had a moment of weakness. If he had a moment of weakness and then recovered quickly, fine, that happens. But that's not what happened. What is the weakness of David here? And the answer I will tell you. People will say, oh, he has a thing for women, or he has a thing for, for power, or he kills, or he does it. It's not the point. You know what his weakness was? And it's something that we spoke about, that the Torah warns you so carefully. It says, Levilti rum levavo. The king needs to have a Sefer Torah with him at all times. So the king doesn't think that he is a god. So the king doesn't think that he is greater than everyone. So the king doesn't think that he can do no wrong, that he has divine powers, that whatever he does is right. And that was in certain kingdoms, that was the understanding that the king, it's good to be the king. So he gets to be with whomever he chooses, and he gets to be to do whatever he chooses because he's the king, and the people recognize that, and sometimes they even want that. And David gets swept away. Why does David get swept away? Because we learn in the first verse that at the beginning of the new year, the seasons when kings go out to battle, and David sends his general, Yoav, and his officers, and all of Israel to go to battle, and they destroy Ammon, and they besiege Rabbah. What does David do? He decides to stay in Jerusalem. This is a recipe for disaster. You never stop working. You never stop going forward. The moment that you decide, I have done everything, I have all that I need, I don't need to go to battle anymore, you're inviting danger, you're inviting a threat to your personality, threat to your kingdom, and that's really what happens. And therefore, in the context of the greatness, because he was so successful, because he achieved so much, he had a moment of smug contentment. And that's a dangerous word, to be content. We're not content till the day we die, you know. We're happy, we're fulfilled, we keep going forward. But contentment is the sense of, I've done it, and now I deserve some credit, or I deserve some reward. And he sends his generals to battle, and he doesn't go. I mean, what is that about? You're King David. You go into battle. But the Tanakh doesn't tell us why he chooses to stay in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, he stays in Jerusalem. And one night, he goes out. Now, Ir David is built on a slope. And obviously, his house was at the height of the top of the slope. And in ancient times, people bathed on the roof. That was a good place to go. And that was, there was extra space. They had, maybe the water was heated up during the day, whatever the reasons are. That's where they showered themselves or they bathed themselves. David gets up at night, walks on his roof, overlooking all of the city of David, and he sees a woman bathing. And the woman is very beautiful. And that apparently is enough to incite the desire of King David, that he said, I see her, I want her. It's a very dangerous reaction, and something that might not, that would be normal for any king, but not necessarily normal for a Jewish king. Notice how many times God's name appears in this story. 0. Doesn't ask God, doesn't talk to God. This is David acting on his own. Verse 3, he calls out. Now he sends for the woman. So now let's introduce the people, you know, his trusted servant, his minister, someone gets the girl or finds out about the girl, the woman. And the person says, isn't that Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now, the fact that he says, hello, isn't that? Sounds like he's kind of saying, don't you know that this is, all right? Nevertheless, it could just be them saying, this is who she is. Her name is Bathsheba. Verse 4, David sends messengers and takes her and comes to her and sleeps with her. And she had just finished having her period and she returned to her home. Maybe that's what she was doing when she was immersing in the bath. And the Nach goes out of its way that she was mitkadeshet mitum ata, which means she's purified from her impurities. Maybe that means that she is able to have children. Maybe that means that he didn't sin in a way that was inappropriately, at least impurity-wise. Whatever the reason that the Tanakh chose to add this aspect, it adds it. A few months later, one can assume, right, the woman becomes pregnant. And she sends a message to David and says, I am pregnant. Generally, it's 3 months. But you don't know, right? In ancient times, they didn't have pregnancy tests. So when would she notice that she has a bump? So the answer is a few months later. Now, David is still at home in Jerusalem, and we'll find out, his Uriah and all the ably-bodied men are still in the fields or in the warriors battling. Now, when David finds out that she's pregnant, he goes into cover-up mode. This is what happens when you sin. When you sin spontaneously. When you realize what you've done, you hope that you don't get caught. when you realize that there's a ramification, a consequence of your action, you have one of two. You can cut the line of lying right there, or the deceit, the inappropriate actions, and say, I have sinned. In which case, this whole story would have gone away. David would have said, I inquired, I didn't understand, I thought she wasn't who she was, and I got her pregnant, and I'm the king, and that was a mistake. But instead, a web of lies is, what do you do with the web? Is spun. Okay? What's lie number one? Where it's an act of deception, really. He sends a message to Yoav, and says to him, send me Uriah the Hittite from the battlefield to come to back to Jerusalem, to come back to his home. Now, what is David's intention? David's intention is to cover up. If Uriah comes back and lies with his wife, then the pregnancy will be assumed to be Uriah's, and then David will have gotten away with it. What is Uriah thinking? And this is important for us in understanding David's infraction here. Uriah comes back in verse 7. David asks, how is Yoav doing? In other words, it's a little bizarre. Uriah is a regular fighter. He comes, he's got a message. The king wants to see you. So he leaves the battlefield, which is miles and miles away, comes back to Jerusalem and meets the king. And the king says, how's my general? It's a strange question, because the answer should have been, you have constant communication with your general. That's what you do. Nevertheless, he says, and how's the people, and how's the war going? Okay. So they have a conversation. It may be strange. It may be okay. It depends on, whether it was done in those days. But here's where it gets interesting. Then David says in verse 8, hey, Uriah, go to your home and wash your feet. Now, go home and wash your feet means, hey, I'm giving you a chance to go sleep with your wife, right? You've been away for months. I wanted to pick you out, especially to help you, to talk to you, to get a feel for the battle. But I'm giving you a free night, go be with your wife. Verse 9, Uriah chooses to sleep at the entrance of the king's palace and doesn't go to his home the whole night. We don't understand why, and perhaps neither does David. They tell David in verse 10 that Uriah didn't go to his house, and David's thinking, foiled, and this is against my plan. So he goes to Uriah and he says to him, you come a long way. Why didn't you go to your home to see your wife? And then Uriah says something quite audacious, obnoxious, or even treasonous. Now it depends. I'm giving you what the interpretations are of the Talmud. Listen to how Uriah speaks to the king. And Uriah says, the ark and Israel and Judah are in the battlefield in a place called Sukkot. And my master Yoav and the servants of my master are in the battlefield camping. And I'm going to go to my house and eat and drink and sleep with my wife. By God's name, Chayecha, and I swear an oath if I said you should do such a thing. David hears this, verse 12, and says, all right, stay where you are, and tomorrow I'll send you back. And Uriah stays where he is, and the next day, he figured he'd give it another shot, right? He drinks with him, he gets him drunk, he goes to sleep in the same place, and he doesn't go back to his house. David understands that with Uriah the Hittite, he is not going to have a cover-up that he needs. So he sends him in the morning with a letter to Yoav. He has Uriah holding the letter. Now it's sealed with the king's seal. You wonder, what does the letter say? Here's what the letter says, verse 15. Let Uriah go to the forefront of the battle, the front line. And when he's there and the battle is fighting hard, you lean back and he's going to be killed. In other words, David is saying, I want him to go and fight in, he doesn't say kill Uriah. He says, bring him to the battlefield, but bring him to the front lines and he'll die. Verse 16, when Yoav was besieging the city, he puts Uriah at a place where he knows that the warriors are. They fight. Some people of David's side died, and who else died? Uriah the Hittite. And verse 18, Yoav sends back the records of the battle and says, this is what you should say. And when you finish reporting this about the battle, the king may get angry and say to you, why did you come so close to the city to attack it? Didn't you know they would shoot from the wall? Who struck down Avimelech? Don't you remember that Avimelech was struck down next to the wall? And you should tell him, your servant Uriah the Hittite was among those killed. Okay, so here's what happens, okay? David sends a message to have Uriah killed. It sounds like from David that he wants only Uriah killed, sends out Uriah to fight at the wall and he's going to get killed. But Yoav didn't like that. Yoav wasn't going to just hang one of his soldiers to be killed. That looks very, very bad. Rather, Yoav said, we'll all go. I'll send a platoon. I'll send a unit. I'll send and that unit will go to a very, very dangerous place. And lo and behold, that whole unit was killed. Now he knows that David's going to be angry to hear that a unit of his was killed. So he says to the messenger, well, tell him that the unit was killed. Then he's going to get angry and he starts screaming. And then at the end say, and Uriah was killed. And you'll see that he'll be quiet afterwards. And that's exactly what happens. And in verse 25, David says to the messenger, give Yoav this messenger. Don't be distressed about this matter. The sword always takes its toll. Press your attack on to the city and destroy it. Then, verse 26. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she lamented over her husband. After the period of mourning was over, David sent and had brought him to his palace. She became his wife, and she bore him a son. And the Lord was angry, or it was evil in the eyes of the Lord, what just took place. Now let's break down this story, because it sounds like David is guilty of two major sins in Judaism. And these two major sins in Judaism warrant the death penalty many times over. Major sin number one is called adultery. You can't take a woman from another man and sleep with her. It is a violation of biblical law. David asked who she was, and the response was she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And he nevertheless took her, slept with her, and even had a child with her, who would be a bastard. Okay. The second cardinal sin seems to be that David murdered Joab. So, for all the greatness we talked about King David and how wonderful and spiritual and everything that in one chapter, in one story, he commits adultery and murder. Is that possible? Is that possible? Now, you have two choices. Either you say that's exactly what happened, and that's how kings behaved, and therefore that's what it is. Or you say that's not exactly what happened. Because if it were the case, God would have punished David so swiftly, and he would never, we talk about the great King David, we would never talk about such things. This is the question that the Talmud presents. Okay? Is it possible that the great King David is guilty of murder and adultery in one story? The Talmud answers it's impossible. Why does the Talmud think that it's impossible? The Talmud says it's impossible because it sees the way that David is presented in the rest of the Tanakh. King David, in the eyes of God, is considered the greatest king, is considered his holy servant, is considered the righteous King David, is considered the Mashiach ben David. He's the progenitor of the Messiah. He is the greatest king, and yet he's guilty of murder and adultery. That doesn't make sense. So the Talmud tries to explain to us what's behind the scenes so we can have a better understanding. The Talmud says the following. There is a law called Aguna. The law of Aguna says that if a woman is married to a man and the man disappears, we cannot assume that the man is dead. And as long as the man has disappeared, you don't hear anything from the man, you have to assume that the man is still alive, unless there's a rumor or you have proof or whatever the case is. And while the man is still alive, the woman is called chained. Aguna means chained. She now cannot marry, bear anyone's children. She is forced to sit alone and wait. This is the plight of the Aguna, because a woman may not have two husbands. A man, on the other hand, according to the Torah, may have two wives. So, because of this idea that a woman whose husband disappears is in a terrible position, the Talmud explains that when they went out to battle, every soldier wrote a get for his wife, a divorce document. And in the event that he does not return in a certain period of time, that divorce document comes into effect. According to the Talmud, then, when David asked, who is this woman? And someone said she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. It is with the assumption that she was the wife of Uriah and now she is divorced from him, this is who she is. Now, this is the Talmud's explanation. In fact, the Talmud goes beyond that and says, anyone who says that David sinned here is wrong. But we don't need to go that far, because we'll see the next chapter that the prophet himself says, David, you sinned. But if we accept that Uriah wrote this pro forma divorce, and in fact, legally, she was not wed, then legally, it was not adultery. Now, that's explanation number one, to get out of the notion that David committed adultery. What about murder? So we can't take the approach of, well, he didn't actually physically kill him, because we know that a person who sends someone to be killed is just like the person who murders. And therefore, we cannot take the position that David is innocent here in killing Uriah. He sent a letter to the general and say, make sure he dies. So in this regard, the Talmud also has, we might call apologetics, which means an explanation, an excuse for David's actions. What the Talmud says is that, yes, David killed Uriah, but Uriah deserved it. Why did Uriah deserve it? Now we have to go back to the discussion that Uriah had with David. Uriah says the following in verse 11. The ark and Israel and Judah are located there, and my master Yoab is there. And I take the God's name, or I swear that I will not do it. Listen, you're talking to the king. First of all, you don't call someone else a master when you're standing in front of the king. It sounds like you're rebelling against the king. By the way, the king commanded him to do something, and he did the opposite. And the king told him, one thing, and he spoke of the general as if he was his king. According to the Talmud, this is worthy of the death penalty. And therefore, David had the rights to send him into battle to be killed because of his disrespect or his treasonous words that he said to David at the time. According to these two explanations, David did not commit adultery and David did not commit murder. Now, we can't say that he is innocent, because in the next chapter, David is rebuked by the prophet. But we can say that he is guilty, just not of, murder in the first degree and adultery in the first degree. We can say that King David, knowing the Jewish law and knowing the loopholes, was able to utilize them in order to get what he wanted. But is that what he should have been doing? We can say that he understood that there was a law of that people are divorced, and therefore, according to legal, technical, David was not having an adultery with Bathsheba. But is that how we want to portray King David? We can say that Uriah might have been worthy of done something against David, but is it make sense that David would be the one? Something smells funny. And this is the tightrope that we have to walk. On the one hand, we're not the ones who are going to say, based on everything we learned about David, that he was a rotten, terrible person, just like any other king, and he succumbed to his sexual desires and did whatever he chose. But on the other hand, we're not going to say he was an angel here. He certainly did actions that might not been, maybe to the letter of the law didn't, but to the spirit of the law were terrible. And therefore, that's our position. Our position is he certainly did sinned. He certainly did bad, and he covered it up. But maybe according to biblical law in those times, they weren't the cardinal sins that we normally think of. Okay? That's how I'm reading this story. And then David thinks he gets away with it. And then chapter 12 begins. I have 7 minutes, so I'm a little caught in time, but I'll try. We're introduced to Natan the prophet. God sends Natan the prophet. We know nothing else about him, but Natan, the prophet, comes to David and he tells him a fable or a mashal, a parable. The parable of the poor man's ewe, the poor man's sheep. So Natan Navi says to David, there are 2 men in a city, one's rich, one's poor. The rich man had lots of cattle. The poor man had nothing except one little sheep. And he took care of that sheep and he raised it like his own child and he ate from him and he took care of him in the best way possible. Excuse me. Sorry. One day, a traveler came to the rich man and didn't want to take anything from his flocks or herd to prepare a meal for the guests who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb. The rich man, had a huge flock, and instead of taking from his flock, he took from the poor man's lamb that I guess he, owned, and he gave it to, right? So the last animal, the one that the guy loved and took care of and treated like his own child, that animal, the rich man gave away. That's the story. Well, verse 5, David is clueless that this is a parable. He thinking this is an actual story. And he flies off the handle and he gets so angry and he says to Natan, that person needs to be killed. And that lamb needs to be repaid 4 times over. And then comes the verse 7, which is the smack in the face. Natan says to David, you're that man. That's called interpretation of the parable. He didn't see it coming. He thought, he was talking about some other thing. David felt so good about himself. And David didn't think that Natan knew that he covered up. And now we need to explain the parable. And there are books written about this to try to understand how exactly that fits in. Generally, David, you're the king, you have all these wives, you have a harem, you have everything that you need, and you go and you take Uriah's wife. You could have taken anyone else, and you take someone who doesn't belong to you. Now, he says it actually straightforward. Look, verse 7. So said God, I anointed you as king. I saved you from Saul. I gave you a wives. I gave you a house. I gave you Judah. I gave you Israel. I added. Why did you reject the word of God to do this evil? And here he says it. Uriah the Hittite you killed, and his wife you took for yourself as your wife, and you killed him in battle. Now, it doesn't say you murdered. And it says the wife afterwards. So God's not exactly saying you committed adultery and murder, but he's saying this smells terrible. This is wrong. This is not you, David. This is not what I expected from you. And therefore, you are going to suffer the punishment, consequences of this action. You tried to cover it up, and now it's going to all come back in your face. Verse 10, the sword will never be far away from your home. Since you used that and you took Uriah, the wife, Uriah, and the wife to be your wife, thus said God in verse 11, I am going to cause evil in your house. I'm going to take your wives in front of your eyes and give them to other people, and they're going to sleep in front of them, sleep with your wives, right? That's measure for measure. You, verse 12, you did it in private, and I'm going to do it in public. Now, this is where I want to stop, okay? Because next week we will discuss David's reaction. Now, once again, his reaction is slow. This we know. His reaction is after the fact. His reaction is having been rebuked and put on the spot and told that your actions, what you've done. His reaction here is critical, and this is another dimension of David that was slow in coming. I'm acknowledging that it should have come faster, but we will talk about it and where it goes from there. Let's just think about God's words, right? So we can't say David was. We can't say David was innocent. Why can't we say David was innocent? Because God said, David, you're guilty. We can't say it was a light sentence, a light crime, because God said, I'm going to do some terrible things to you, and it sounds measure for measure. You ignored, you embarrassed the word of God. You did things that should not have been done, and you tried to cover it up. And as a result, your actions are going to be out in the public. And this is what David, as I said, it was the big cover up that David realized too late, that the prophet said will no longer be covered up. This will be your sin to bear. This is the end of this class. It's in a few seconds. The video is going to stop. But I want us to appreciate the significance and the import of this incredible story. And what does it do to David? It will hurt him terribly. Will it destroy him? Or will he somehow emerge from it and will learn from his mistakes? This is the big question. I'm leaving you in a cliffhanger here. What's going to happen to King David, and how does he deal? How does he emerge from the pickle that he himself had put himself? And this is something that we need to continue to read and understand and appreciate what it says about King David in the greater story. Okay, that's our class for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.